Okay, welcome to our late afternoon session. We're going to go till 5 o'clock, and at 5 o'clock we're going to stop dead in our tracks. It won't be tragic, because they have to prepare the room, and there'll be supper upstairs. That's where the food will be, upstairs. So
hopefully we won't be dead.
We'll see what happens. Yeah, we'll see what happens. Maybe I will, but you won't.
But we're not supposed to be afraid of that.
That's right.
Courage. So Micah and I put our heads together between the sessions, and we have now it occurs to me, 4 topics that we want to touch on, to try to pull some of the threads together from this morning, but especially from the previous session. And the first is pretty musical and literary. The second is political. The third is historical. And the fourth, which only just occurs to me when we wanted to talk about it, has to do with felicitas and the notion of Lustspiel versus Tragödie, Trauerspiel, the comic piece, the tragic. But first of all, I want to put together some comments that Jim made and Gesa made, and implicitly Jennifer, but also Karen. This is a really aesthetic question, and I hope they'll all come together at the end. It's this: does tragedy, in kind of a literary or musical sense, does tragedy necessarily entail heroic sacrifice, or if not heroic sacrifice, at least the death of some kind of sacrificial victim, like Gretchen? The second part of this question is: are there models of tragedy that do not glorify sacrifice, or is the glorification of heroic sacrifice death of some sort? Is that necessary? And I think this is going to feed into the political question too. So Karen, maybe you could say a few words about the way that music was used by the Nazis and not used.
Sure. What I addressed in my essay, and also some subsequent research, is the extent to which virtually no tragic music was written during the Third Reich. And Hofmeister Verlag has released every month a list of new publications. And so 1940 or halfway through 1939, the tragic music drops out entirely. So you see almost no requiems being written. And tragic genres, requiem most prominent, becomes adopted by emigre composers. And there was sort of a requiems for the Germany that's being a part of it. There seems to be a failure to mourn within Germany. And so that would seem to be something that is a critique for inner immigration. But I argue actually that it's a way to align oneself with the kind of informal edicts by Goebbels, and then more informally with local Nazi now that you should not mourn sacrifice, but rather celebrate sacrifice for the country. So this kind of peculiar status in which it is political by being apolitical.
So the official line would be then that they would want music that would glorify sacrifice. So what would we think then that is tragic music? Tragic music would be that which facilitates mourning, or that which celebrates heroic sacrifice. So let me try to connect that now to what Jim and Gesa were saying. So could you sort of restate what you said about sacrifice before? Bring us back up to speed?
Yeah, no, just a concern as soon as, it seems to me that as soon as tragedy involves death and in its relationship to the collective, then a risk is opened up, and perhaps also an opportunity, I don't know, that the death could be instrumentalized. That one way that the rhetoric of tragedy could be offered, and I'm giving the background to this seems to me to be some of what's going on when Lothar Benjamin talks about tragedy in the wake of the outbreak of the First World War, that a war that was supposed to be triumphant starts going bad and starts producing a lot of death and suffering, and a rhetoric is invoked by people very close to Benjamin that this is justifiable as a tragic event, and the implication is that these dead are sacrificed for us, and that we establish our national character and our national solidarity through the blood of these sacrificed victims. And so that as soon as the death becomes displaced in that way and the collective recognizes itself in that death, the danger, I think, is near that this process could be instrumentalized as a way of justifying a violence that otherwise would be unacceptable.
So the sacrifice is a necessary fate.
That the language of tragedy borders a language of redemptive sacrifice. And what Benjamin, I think, wants to do is to draw a distinction there, to suggest that tragedy, in fact, comes up to the boundaries of redemptive sacrifice, but doesn't assert the redemption, that the redemption is elsewhere, that it's, that for Greek tragedy, the meaning of Greek tragedy wasn't the consolidation of the Athenian polis. The meaning of Greek tragedy only occurs afterwards, so to speak, retrospectively. We see that it was pointing beyond itself. But as soon as the collective recognizes itself in these tragic deaths, then what we have is a kind of sacrificial distortion of tragedy, or distortion of death, shall we say, that is.
Karsten?
Yes, I want to give a personal note to this. In your paper, you mentioned the broadcast which announced that the defeated Stalingrad, which happens to be one of my first memories, that very broadcast. I remember the Schwarze Volksempfänger and the music. My early memories, they form sort of a mosaic. So I have a fairly distinct memory of this event, and then some others, but I have difficulty putting them in a clear temporal order. You see, I was then, I was 6 or 5, and I think a question we should ask is: there was the Nazi line, the official line, how music should be used, which you report, right? The interesting question is: how did Germans who listened to these broadcasts, and how did they react? How did they follow the Nazis? Was this how Germans felt at the time about the war, Stalingrad, sacrifice, and so on? They didn't, at least not in my circles. And I want to read here a poem which my mother wrote at the time about Berlin. I have also another one about Stalingrad. And this gives you a feeling how, from within, so to speak, not now ex post facto. It says, zum Tod verurteilt, knirscht die Stadt in Ketten. Am Himmel tanzt berauscht die Sommernacht, vom Fieberband des Tages blind gemacht. Verdammte schreien zum Himmel, sie zu retten. Sie schreien nur in diesen heißen Nächten. Sie schreien ohne Wort und ohne Laut. Doch wenn der Morgen in den Dächern graut, tauchen sie auf aus der Verzweiflung Schächten. Sie heben ihre Augen in das Leuchten, ein Lächeln löset den verkrampften Mund. Und ihre Hände tasten aus dem Grund, vom Tod Befreite steigen aus dem feuchten Bartuch der Nacht. Bist du uns noch geschenkt, heiliges Licht? Ist uns noch Frist gegeben, dich zu empfangen, du geliebtes Leben? O Lobgesang, bis sich die Fackel senkt. That's how they reacted. And I could read other poems, but this is not, I think one shouldn't think in the circles. My parents at that point, I remember that too, said the war is lost. They just hoped that it would somehow would be done with as quickly as possible. But it was very difficult to find a mechanism to bring this about. And I mean, is this poem tragic? I would say yes. And it's tragic precisely because of the last line. It's not, the event is horrific, the bombing and so on, which, as I said, I remember. But it's the ending that makes it tragic, because the reaction is life affirming, finally. It says, bist du uns noch geschenkt, heiliges Licht, du geliebtes Leben. So this life that gets affirmed, despite the horror. And I think that's tragedy here, although here just in a short poem.
It seems to me that there's something like a synapse between lived experience and the translation of that experience into something like knowledge. And that this poem is a really good example of, I think maybe what Barbara was talking about a preconceptual shaping of experience, in this case, horrific experience, into something, into a form in which it becomes accessible to human understanding. And it seems to me that this is the way art in general, I have to admit, I'm sort of coming loose from my attachment to the whole concept of the tragic, because it seems to me that what I've been thinking of as tragic is not necessarily tragic in a narrow sense. It could in some circumstances also be comic, not in this one. But what's crucial is not whether it's tragic, whether it's comic, whether it's an opera, whether it's a poem, but this moment of transformation into a form that's intelligible to us. A very large event, is turned into a few lines, and then you've got kind of a handle on it. Not the final handle, because then art comes before history, philosophy, and everything else. That somehow art is antecedent to these things, and that's the ethical role of the tragic and or the comic, but art in general.
Maybe this is too hard a question, but could you characterize a poem in English without paraphrasing it?
Can I characterize it? I can give you a paraphrase quickly.
Okay.
That would be kind.
Yeah, I can translate. That is condemned to death, the city is in chains. On the sky, just talk about it, the summer night, sort of in top, it's a wonderful summer night, as it were. But it has been made blind by the fire of the day. And verdammte, those who are condemned, they scream at the sky in order to save themselves. They scream only in these hot nights. They scream without word, without sound. But when morning sort of dawns, then they appear out of these Schichten, out of these Schacht is a mine shaft, out of these shafts of despair. That is really despair, those shafts. And they lift their eyes to the sky, really. And something like a smile loosens around their stiffened mouth here, that is in a way frozen by terror. And their hands grasp the ground. And people liberated from death for the moment, as if they have escaped, they got another night of bombing. They go into their garden, whatever, out of the moist, feuchte Bartuch der Nacht. The Bartuch was really a funeral shroud. It's moist, and they arise from that. And then, have we still been given some more time? Because they're still alive. They can continue. And to embrace you, O beloved life. So is there still time to embrace you, O beloved life? And it says, oh, song of praise, in a way, song of praise of life. And then the final thing, until the fackel, the torch, goes down.
I wonder if we can delve a little bit more into what we've so far called the suffering. And to thank you, Carsten, to a certain degree, but also some of the political discussions we've had. We had a little mini discussion here during the break about talking about suffering, which is sort of to me at least, a very removed term. What is suffering? And I wonder whether we can look at tragedy as a practice of emotional ethics, because we really haven't talked about the emotionality of.
Can you speak up?
I think we haven't talked enough about the emotionality of tragedy. We've talked about suffering, but really, what is ethical about transferring or communicating the idea of the emotions that you go through, and in a way that's a very emotional communication, as you talked about the forms of art that are open to us. But how are we capturing the turmoil of emotion in any kind of form? And, so it goes back to an earlier term I used, which is how do we capture the chaos of tragedy in an artistic form?
Mark? Steve, you asked the question, does tragedy necessarily entail sacrifice? I want to give two answers to that. The first comes back to the point Giza raised earlier about the instrumentalization of women. Women are frequently the self-sacrificial victims in tragedy. Agnes Bernauer would be a good example, and the Nazis, of course, produced Agnes Bernauer quite a lot on the National Socialist stage, because it's presented as a death without suffering, if you will, without that emotional dimension. Why is there no suffering? Because the telos completely overrides the suffering, and that is the instrumentalization. You see it also independently of women in a Nazi film like Hitler, Junge Quecks. There's a death, but it is completely accepted because it is for the higher cause. And I think what makes these works not tragic, but martyr dramas in some way, is their simplicity. There is no element of collision. Collision is possible when you regret death, when you see it as something that perhaps is necessary from whatever framework, but you still regret it. You see that in Marquis Posa, in Don Carlos, you see it in Hochhuth's Der Stellvertreter. They're both self-sacrificial moments at the end, but they regret it. They long to embrace life. And that gives us a moment of suffering that seems to be absent in this instrumentalization. So that I would say, without the suffering, you don't have tragedy. Then there is another strand of tragedy where it's very clear that these plays don't glorify sacrifice, and that is because the tragic hero is in many ways a figure with whom we can partially identify because he embodies certain characteristics we admire, but we're also completely repelled by the person. Again, there's a collision there, a ambivalence. Ajax would be an example of that, as would be Macbeth. There is no glorification of sacrifice there. We abhor the sacrifice, and we can only admire Macbeth partly because he has a certain secondary virtue, ambition, and in the end he's willing to pledge his life for what he stood for. But it is very far removed from any glorification of sacrifice. So those are two different strands where the sacrifice is not glorified.
But is it necessary? Is the sacrifice absolutely necessary for it to be a tragedy? And I'm partly thinking of, there are examples in Greek drama. Orestes, of course, is a survivor and a heroic figure. So even if we don't glorify it, is the death of the hero or the death of somebody necessary?
I think it probably is, otherwise you don't have suffering. In some cases, I'll give you an example, the greatest suffering is not to die. Two examples. At the end of Sophocles' Antigone, Antigone is dead, Haemon is dead, and Creon's wife is dead, and Creon lives. He's a completely broken person. In some ways you get a sense, depending on how it's staged, of course, that Creon is in worse shape. He needs to live with his mistake. So there is no death, but he has sacrificed his ability to identify with the good. That is a different kind of sacrifice. It is not death, but it's a sacrifice of moral principles. Another would be Anouilh's version of Antigone, which is much more complex in the sense that Antigone is presented as a somewhat mindless figure who's automatically embracing a certain position, and Creon is the tragic figure because he wants actually Antigone to withdraw her position. He's trying to govern, and he can't resolve this conflict. And that inner tension forces him to sacrifice principles rather than his life. But there is always sacrifice. Otherwise, I think you have something else, like a martyr drama or a genre that is close to tragedy. It would be a tragic conflict that nonetheless ends in a moment of reconciliation. Nathan der Weise would be an example. I would also consider that Colonus would be an example of that.
Just want to remind that in Benjamin's theory of tragedy, you have these two aspects. You have the necessity of sacrifice, but he says tragedy is too a Gerichtsprozess, a legal process. Which means that the necessity of sacrifice is questioned in a way. the notion of a legal process doesn't give any sense. It doesn't make any sense if there is no possibility, if you don't have a choice between victimization and to be free. And I think this ambivalence is very important and very characteristic of Greek drama, Greek tragedy in a way, that you have the sacrifice, but you have the question if the sacrifice is necessary.
Todd?
I'm a little bit confused, but I'll try to express my confusion. I'm too listening. Okay, I think like when I listened to Jim speak and I listened to Carsten speak, and I think it was sort of presupposed in some of the things that Carsten wrote, some of the people that he wrote about, the sacrifice takes place in a teleological context, right? That's the Isaac Abraham situation, and there's this thing, teleological suspension of the ethical, right? And because of that, it makes sense. So for me, sacrifice always is involved with a dative, right? It's a sacrifice for something. Or in your case, it's a thankfulness for something. It's a dative involved too. I wasn't quite sure, but in your case, when you talked about sacrifice, it was a sacrifice for a reason. There was always a telos to this thing. And the telos was probably bad. So sacrifice was in a negative connotation. Whereas when you spoke about your poem, your mother's poem, there was a word in there which I interpreted quite differently than you did, and I didn't notice it until you sort of gave the paraphrasing. The word in a poem, to me, in a lyrical poem, the word do always has a special meaning. And you used the word do at the end when this thing turned around from the negative to the positive, sort of like the turning word, if not the turning point, was the word do. Now, I thought this do had a religious connotation, not an affirmation of life. Now, I think it probably was more of a do liebe Gott, nicht du liebes Leben. So I think you may be interpreting that more of an it's an affirmation in any case, but what is actually being affirmed, or if there's something beyond life, affirming life, that's not quite clear in the do that you read to me.
No, I think if we look at the text, it is geliebtes Leben. That has an exclamation point, and du geliebtes Leben. It's a geliebte Leben.
Well,
I don't think, although she was a daughter of a minister, she had, I think, didn't consider herself religious, didn't believe in God. So I think it's Leben.
I just wonder, like, thankfulness at that particular situation, given the new religious information you just gave me, whether this du geliebtes Leben can be totally divorced from a religious context in which sacrifice takes place.
Let me put it this way, repeated, I think a number of contributions in that volume refer to Hölderlin's Hälfte des Lebens, quote that text. This is a little bit like that, although the negative Hälfte, as it were, is more prominent. But in the end, she cannot let go of that, what in the Hölderlin poem is the first stanza, right? She can't let go, she doesn't let, and she thinks it important to keep that tension between these two sides. And I think that is characteristic of not only that poem.
No, I understand that.
But it's not a sacrifice. Notice in that poem, there's no sacrifice.
No, I mean, the sacrifice was like, you responded to the question about sacrifice with that poem, and that's what it was against what it means. But when you put Hölderlin into this poem, like, Hölderlin is also in a larger context, talking an awful lot about Christian mythology or Greek mythology, so there's that Christian context in it too.
I didn't want to talk about all of Hölderlin, he just said one.
No, I didn't either, I just wanted